again, and we're back with another session covering all things IoT today. Next up, we're having a chat with somebody who many of you don't need to be introduced to, Mr. Andrew Parkin-White, who has been my predecessor doing all things IoT here at MEF, and he is an advisor with us. We're going to be talking. Hello, Andrew. Hello.
Hello, Nassia.
So we're going to have a chat to talk about the best practices when it comes to IoT connectivity, which is a nice, I think, follow-up from the previous discussion that we had with the panel about IoT connectivity. We're now going to be looking into more details and specifics based on the surveys that you, Andrew, have been working on. So let's start with that. Let's talk a little bit about what kind of surveys, what kind of research you have been doing.
So essentially, we've got three pieces of work which are either complete or underway. MEF members will probably recall that last year we did a survey into IoT drivers, challenges, priorities, technology choices, and supplier preferences. And we spoke to 450 enterprises who were already using IoT. And they range from quite small to quite large enterprises. And the core focus was on IoT segments. This year, we've just finished the field work for another survey, but this time we're looking at organizations who are planning to use IoT in the next 6 to 12 months in those same countries. And just to remind people what those countries were, they were Brazil, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Spain, UK, and the USA. So quite a broad spread. And in terms of the segments we looked at, we examined what was happening in automotive manufacturing systems, transportation, storage and logistics, utilities and energy, healthcare, manufacturing and industrial, retail and wholesale, agriculture, and smart cities and intelligent buildings was added this year. We didn't cover it in the survey last year. I've also been working with MEF on another piece of work, which we've called best practices in IoT connectivity. And there I've been talking to a range of IoT CSPs from across the globe to find out how they're responding to some of the issues that we've highlighted as part of our survey work. So we've spoken to Pod Group, Bix, Zariat, Tata Communications, SI, Deutsche Telekom, and Wireless Logic. So those have been happening in the last few weeks. So yeah, that's kind of the background to where we are. And I think it's a case of have a look if you haven't seen last year's report and watch this space for this year's survey report and the best practice connectivity report coming later in the year.
Great. Yeah, those reports, they provide invaluable information. Folks, if you haven't seen them, highly recommend you take a look. It will save you a lot of time scratching your head and trying to figure out a question. So speaking of which, for the people that might have not seen it, and even for those who have read through the reports, let's distill it down to some key insights, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd like to do is look at what we found out in 2021 and some of the emerging themes from 2022. And as you say, Nassia, there is a long report and a series of short reports available on the MEF website, and also the data tables are available to MEF members. And I'd encourage people to look into it because the detail is there. So if you want to find out attitudes to 5G in the automotive sector, you can dig a bit deeper into that. But going back to your question, some of the highlights that came up in 2021, and I apologize for the number of statistics and percentages I'm going to throw at you in the next half an hour or so. But we saw that the key driver in 2021, so for enterprises, 83% of them said that using technology for business advantage was the most important driver. Very interestingly, we asked them about technologies and what technologies they currently used and what they were planning. And we saw that there was a very large usage of 2G and 3G technologies in play. Mm-hmm. And even though companies are going to move to 4G and ultimately 5G, there is still this large install base which presents a whole series of challenges and potentially opportunities for suppliers to help enterprises through this sort of evolution. Interestingly, 5G generated a lot of interest, but not actually many organizations. Only around 3% had actually deployed 5G. And again, in the report, we look behind the drivers of 5G and what's particularly exciting them. And it's probably not what you expect. It's probably more about bandwidth than it is about low latency. We are sort of going beyond connectivity. What is most important to enterprises already using IoT? And the key requirements came out as security and over-the-air upgrades. We were working in a difficult period, and one of the questions we asked is, how has your IoT planning been affected by COVID? And in this instance, 77% of organizations said that it completely or significantly changed how they operate their business. Jumping forward to 2022, this figure had fallen to 40%, which shows organizations that are probably coming more in tune with what's really happening in IoT. We asked them about suppliers and those using IoT. The most trusted IoT partner, with 89% of enterprises trusting them, was the mobile network operator. But what we're finding is connectivity alone isn't enough, and support and technical innovation are very important supplier qualities. Only 28% of organizations actually cited cost as a driver for their choice of suppliers. And there are three essential requirements emerging as part of this research for what suppliers to all vertical sectors should offer, and they should be able to integrate all elements of the solution. We've heard that in the previous discussion, handle the complete project from end to end, and offer ongoing support.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, Andrew, and my apologies for jumping in here, but I want to, when it's fresh in people's minds, I want to highlight a couple things that you mentioned. One is, even though 5G is important, we have a lot of install base out there that is still utilizing 2 and 3G, and with a lot of operators around the world sunsetting, the legacy technology, that will affect a lot of that install base in more than one ways. I would assume, from the device manufacturer all the way to the connectivity providers and how they deal with all that.
Yeah, and I think this is coming as a considerable cost to the enterprise. And some of the simple end-to-end type applications, that they're quite happy on some of these legacy technologies, and I think enterprises would see no real need to change in the short term. But as you say, sunsets are happening, networks are being closed down, so they're into this forced migration. And I think, as I said, it's a challenge and opportunity for suppliers to those sorts of enterprises to push forward and help enterprises go through this path. And it's not just about 2G and 3G now, it's about how they move to 4G and what flavor of 4G they want, and then ultimately what happens with 5G.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite interesting also that cost, at least, when it came to enterprises that already had deployed some IoT solution, wasn't on the top of the list. It wasn't their key consideration. Security was for them. Which also it demystifies in many ways when we're talking about IoT connectivity and talking about how it has become more commoditized. So the question in my head is that, are we doing this to ourselves? And by ourselves, I mean, mobile providers. Are we playing the cost game because we think we have to, when our customers are not even close to that area?
No, I think that's a very interesting observation, and I've seen two different pictures. I'll talk a little bit about those planning teams in a moment, and their cost was much more of a factor than it is for companies already using IoT. And I think it boils down to people thinking about the business case, the investment case, the return on investment, rather than the cost. And we see these sort of headline figures in the marketplace, sort of 10 years connectivity for $1, and this sort of race to the bottom as far as cost is concerned. And there's only part of the market that's really interested in that. The larger part of the market, it's critical to their business. It's critical to remaining competitive. and that they're willing to invest and willing to invest large amounts in these sorts of projects. So, cost less of a consideration. Admittedly, as the market develops, as with any market, cost becomes a greater factor. Segments that are happening in the next, perhaps beyond 3 years, are potentially more cost sensitive than those who are early adopters or early mainstream.
Great, yeah, and I think it's probably going to be the different segments. Have they deployed IoT solutions? Are they thinking of deploying IoT solutions, or they haven't gotten started? So the needs of each one of them will be very different, and we've seen some of that come through the surveys, which I'm going to let you get on with the information.
I think just to add to your point, Nassia, no doubt somebody said this already today, but the IoT world on the demand side is wide and varied. You might have a very simple metering application or a chip in a coffee vending machine or whatever, and they don't need the same as something that is mission critical or for use in healthcare or manufacturing. It's really is different scenarios for different applications, which is why I say kind of dig into the data a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So if we talk about 2022, what we were trying to find out is, what is the scope in the market? So how many of these things are organizations planning to launch? And we gave them various sort of ranging from under 100 IoT devices to 5,000 plus. And the bulk of the market was between 500 and 5,000, around 60, 70%. 70% were in that sort of figure, 3% at the 5,000 plus end. And in terms of their future growth, they were looking to grow their market, grow their installations. Well, 77 are planning to grow between 5% and 25%, not much more beyond that. But it kind of backs up, probably some of the figures we saw earlier in terms of where the IoT growth is coming from. I mentioned that in last year's survey, using technology for business advantage was the most important criteria. When we looked at those planning to adopt, the most important category by far was cost saving. So in terms of the way they undertake their operations, they're looking to save costs. And the second highest was digital transformation. Using technology for business advantage is still important, but at around about 61%. And then sitting behind that is improving information workflows and an improved customer experience. So we then asked enterprises, you want to do these projects, so what are your key challenges within these sorts of projects? And the thing that struck me when I looked at the headline results, and remember these at a global level, the things enterprises find most challenging, those planning to use IoT, are the impact on their processes, 73% reporting that as an issue. The integration of multiple technologies, again, a sort of challenge or opportunity for suppliers, and the strong impact it has on legacy systems. Answering, we touched on this already, but we asked them what forms of connectivity they would like. Nobody is planning to use 2G, so that kind of tells a story compared to the already installed base. Interestingly, 20% still want to use 3G. 4G is planned by around 77% of organizations. And there are still organizations, depending on applications, if you look at non-cellular technology using Wi-Fi and LPWAN. We also asked about satellite this year, and interestingly, out of the 270 organizations we spoke to, nobody was planning to use satellite. We may be a little bit early on this, but there seems to be some noise around that. So finally, we looked at 5G, and we asked, are you using it? We didn't see much evidence of that, but we did see that pushing 90% of organizations are evaluating or planning to use 5G at some point in the future. So it's a case of watch this space. So if we move on, we've asked enterprises, so we asked them a lot about connectivity. Now, interestingly, we asked them how much they expect to spend on connectivity. So out of every dollar spent, how much is the connectivity element? And this fell between 10 and 15% in the bulk of organizations planning to use in terms of what they expected to spend on IoT. And we also asked them about their needs beyond connectivity. Interestingly, security came out top when we asked enterprises already using it. It was much lower for those who are planning to use. And I suspect this is maybe because people are unaware of what it's like to have a live application, the security implications. They were much more interested in things like cloud connectivity, processing data at the edge, and the use of digital twins.
Yeah, I think, like you said, Andrew, it's because they don't know what they don't know yet at that stage. They're still trying to figure out what is happening and how to connect things when they haven't done their deployment. Therefore, it's not on the top of the consideration, because I think that the gap is quite different and quite big between those who have deployed IoT services and what the need for IoT security is, and for those that haven't. So people don't know what they don't know. I think it comes down to that.
Yeah, and I'd say that would hold true for quite a few aspects of the research we've done. You get a very different picture if you're already experienced with IoT to those who have not yet launched their live applications. And I'm sure education is key here, and like the importance of an element like IoT security or analytics to an organization to bring these to their attention. Like, don't launch without it, you could be in serious trouble. We asked the same question to those planning to launch IoT about who would you most trust to provide a cellular-based IoT solution. And interestingly, as we had mobile network operators at the top of the pile for already using, they were at the bottom of the pile for those who are planning to launch a cellular-based IoT solution. Top of the pile came systems integrators, and that kind of backs up the previous discussion that I caught. And interestingly, the hyperscalers are very important to organizations, cloud companies, Google, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft. Mm-hmm. And we also asked, what criteria are you using to evaluate potential suppliers of IoT solutions? Again, we got a slightly different message here. When we talked about cost being important earlier, but it was only 38% of businesses saying that cost was the driver. The most important aspect was having solutions that were specific to their industry or their vertical, so sector specific solutions, and technical support was also very important. The rest of the categories are kind of in the middle, as we asked about local presence of suppliers, global reach, technical innovation, business model, and end-to-end support.
I think it's quite good, but very, I think, informative for our audience, because there's going to be people who have deployed and they're servicing existing customers, and people who are looking, to deploy the services. So even from the perspective of the enterprise, what is key is important, but also from the perspective of the telco, those who are not only the telco, but the system integrators, the MVNOs, the hyperscalers. Is good to see that the difference between having and not having deployed the solutions. I mean, for me, it was when I first saw that, I was like, and heard you just saying it now again, it reminded me that we cannot ever assume that one thing that is important to an existing customer who has tried and possibly have failed or been successful to be the same as when you haven't started. And it was a question on the previous panel, somebody was asking which is the best approach. And I think now we can see from this service, Andrew, that there is not one size fits all. It depends where you are on the journey.
Definitely. And the final point I'll make on this year's survey is what suppliers can do more of to support these companies' IoT deployments and aspirations. And it wasn't dissimilar to those already using IoT. And the key thing cited, the main reason, 66% said it was very important for suppliers to handle the project from start to finish, and 60% said integrating all elements of the solution. Cost effective, again, we keep checking and cross-checking throughout the survey. That was cited by 43% of the organizations we spoke to. So that sort of concludes our conversation on the survey, and let's say I urge people to read it. So I think you now want to talk about another piece of work we're doing, specifically called best practices.
Exactly. It would be good to get some key, insights from the feedback that you have received around the best practices of IoT.
Yeah. So yeah, what I'd like to do is, we're doing a project looking at best practices in IoT connectivity, and I've taken some of the data from the survey and asked, what's important around connectivity. I've asked this question of enterprises, but we've also spoken to a range of leading IoT CSPs, including Pod Group, BIX, Zaria, Tata, SI, Deutsche Telekom, and Wireless Logic. And we asked them the same questions as the enterprise to find out how close or far away they are from each other in terms of their thinking. So I'm going to pull out some of the key issues that emerged. So first of all, the most important criteria for enterprises is suppliers offering a fully managed solution. We asked on a scale of rate these on a scale of 1 to 10, and 1 being low, 10 being high, and that came out as 8.6, so a very high score. The second highest was suppliers being able to onboard devices efficiently and integrate them into their IoT applications. That scored 8.4. There was very little that didn't score above 7. The only thing that didn't was ensuring a consistent quality of service, which came in at 5.5, which surprised me somewhat, because I would have thought that uptime was quite important to those sorts of things. I'm just going to shoot through the list, and I'm going to give the CSP perspective and the enterprise perspective on these issues. So if we stick with this, ensuring we have consistent quality of services, this is the largest diversion between what an enterprise thinks it needs and what a CSP thinks an enterprise needs. So the CSP score was up at 9.4 compared to 5.6 for the enterprise, so a variance of 3.8, 3.9 in those sorts of figures. They're offering a fully managed solution. CSPs rating it 6.6, enterprises rating it 8.6, so a bit of divergence between those. Offering global connectivity, the enterprise rated that at 7.3, the CSPs at 9. Adding the caveat that quite a few of these CSPs have global connectivity as their core element. Rated highly by the enterprises, having a flexible billing and management platform, which came in as 8.3, their score, compared to 7.2 for the enterprise. I asked them about changing solution providers, changing connectivity providers. This is important for the enterprise at 7.8 out of 10, and 7 for the enterprises. I think I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into some of the initial conclusions that are coming out, rather than bombard you with figures. So the key sort of headline thinking is, we know that enterprises want a fully managed solution that is sector specific. One of the key findings coming out from the enterprises is that they see eSIM as a critical tool, and it's very much on their critical path as a technology moving forward. And this is also true for CSPs as well. And solutions across multiple connectivity technologies are important, and enterprises need a roadmap and they need future-proofing. The key word that came up time and time again when I was having discussions was flexibility. So suppliers need to be flexible in dealing with evolving enterprise needs. And this service wraparound is important. So offering security, analytics, cloud connectivity, billing and management platforms, performance reporting, etc. And as we've said already, cost effective and solutions that achieve their business goal is equally important. So I think you wanted to pick up, Nassia, on a couple of those aspects in more detail.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes left, I think. So the best thing at this point is just to pick an overarching theme around the best practices between and across, where we see cross between the enterprises and CSPs.
Yeah. I think we can pick up on two aspects, and I know we're running short of time, so we can do those very quickly. The first is roaming, and I know you've got a session on roaming later. And we asked, what percentage of the connections will be roaming, and around 25 to 50% of devices are planning to be roaming devices in these enterprises that are going to adopt IoT solutions. And I think some trends are emerging around the purchase of IoT SIMs on a global basis, and we see more contracts awarded this way. The level of coverage required, and it's not always ubiquitous, and it really depends on the application. It depends on the geography as well. You have a large landmass, rural areas that might be underserved, and problems for agricultural applications or for continuity in transit. Roaming, as I say, is important, and also that the final location of an IoT device may be unknown. It's manufactured in one country, shipped to another, and the same holds true for modules and chipsets. And finally, we'll talk about this later, but permanent roaming is an issue in some countries, and it needs to be addressed. And there are multiple solutions that IoT CSPs are evolving to deal with that. And I guess we're out of time there, Nassia.
Unfortunately, we are. I mean, there is so many key insights, which I will prompt everyone to download the reports and have a look. It's a lot of good information. And when the new report of this year is published, to make sure that everybody, is informed about it. When we're looking at best practices for IoT, I think if I were to pick one thing is don't assume. As we've seen between the different, areas of those who have deployed IoT services and those who haven't, and also between the telcos and the enterprises. If you need to find something, understand that people do not know what they don't know, and dig. That's what I would say.
I'd summarize what you just said. I mean, in two words: flexibility and education. And I think
absolutely
summarizes
it.
Well,
thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate you joining us and covering the best practices on IoT and the surveys that we have done here at MEF. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.